So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions video. Now, the Detroit Lions are 1-0. After a big Thursday night football victory to start the season on the right foot, the Detroit Lions return home to Ford Field and welcome back the Seattle Seahawks. Now, the Detroit Lions, of course, are 1-0 after a 21-20 victory over the reigning champion Kansas City Chiefs in Arrowhead a week ago on Thursday Night Football. And the Seahawks, surprisingly, are an 0-1 after a very shocking 12-30 defeat at the hands of the division rival Los Angeles Rams at home a week ago on Sunday. On paper, the Seattle Seahawks don't look like the same team they did last year. On the field, the Seattle Seahawks had a lot of problems going up against the Los Angeles Rams team that many thought wouldn't be very good this year. So the Seattle Seahawks are off to a slow start. The Lions are off to a hot start, but as we learned last year, never underestimate the Seattle Seahawks. Last season, the Detroit Lions and Seattle Seahawks had arguably the best game of the year. A 48-45 victory for the Seattle Seahawks, putting them at 2-0 on the year. A game that saw over 1,075 total yards, 93 total points, receiving records for the Detroit Lions, while teams averaged 8.3 yards per play offensively for the entirety of the game. This was a back and forth scoring fest. No defense could stop the opposing offense. And of course, no defense could stop the other. And of course, no offense could be stopped. I don't believe either team punted in this game. There were a couple of turnovers that led to points. But other than that, this was a very high scoring game, very offensive heavy game. And the Detroit Lions, unfortunately, walked out as the losers in this one. So this week is a revenge game. The Seattle Seahawks come back to Ford Field. They come back to a hostile environment in the season opener, the home opener that is for Ford Field. And they're walking into a very hostile environment versus a team with a lot of confidence and a lot of really good matchups. Now, taking a look at the Seattle Seahawks, despite being 1-0, despite having a blowout loss to the Los Angeles Rams a week ago, they are not a bad football team. They have a lot of strengths in their weapons. Their receivers are very strong. Their running backs are very strong. Their quarterback is very, very solid. And on paper, their secondary and linebacking core are very good as well. Now, they are struggling in the trenches. Their offensive line is significantly weaker this time around than it was last year, as it seems both tackles are going to miss, as the left tackle and right tackle for the Seattle Seahawks both left last week's game early. Now, they have since signed veterans to take their spot. It seems as though at least Charles Cross will not be playing in this game. So that leaves a really good opportunity for the Detroit Lions to get home, to get some pass rush, and to force some turnovers and mistakes with the solid pass rush that they showed a week ago versus a top 5, top 10 offensive line in Kansas City. That same line does not exist for the Seattle Seahawks, and the line should be able to take advantage and force some turnovers, mistakes, and of course get to the quarterback. Now, as I said, on paper, their secondary was very good and their linebacking core is very solid, but on the field last Sunday, it didn't really seem to be that way. Taking a look at the Detroit Lions' strengths, again, their weapons are very, very strong. Amon-Ra St. Brown, of course, is a very good wide receiver. Josh Reynolds is the team's leading wide receiver after 1 week. Sam Laporta had 5 catches on 5 targets and had a massive impact week 1. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery showed that they could very well and very capably take on an offensive role and help this team succeed. And of course, they have the offensive line to back it up. That's not even including Khalif Raymond. That's not including Marvin Jones. That's not including, Brock Wright, who is a security blanket for Jared Goff all of last season. Their weapons, despite not being as high-powered or flashy on paper as the Seattle Seahawks, are very efficient weapons, and they have brought the Lions to statistical success in the past. The quarterback play as well for the Detroit Lions is very high. Jared Goff at home is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Jared Goff at Ford Field in a dome in a controlled environment with a home crowd behind him is one of the most statistically successful quarterbacks in the league last year and should be very, very strong this year. The offense on paper got better. The Lions, of course, have that home field advantage, have that comfortability, have that familiarity, and should be able to take advantage of that versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, the Lions' strength is going to come from their pass rush and their offensive line. Brad Holmes has spent 3 straight off seasons putting assets into the offensive line, putting assets into the defensive line, putting assets into the trenches for the Detroit Lions, and it's finally paying off. The Lions have a top 3 offensive line in football. The Lions' pass rush versus the Kansas City Chiefs, another very good offensive line, was really strong a season ago, and now they have the opportunity to take over this game in Seattle. They have the opportunity to get after Geno Smith, get after the running back. The run defense was really solid versus Kansas City. The pressure was really solid versus Kansas City. And now going up against a significantly weaker offensive line, the pass rush should have the opportunity to take over, while Seattle's defensive line really doesn't have a star. They don't have a Chris Jones. They don't have an Aaron Donald. They don't have an elite pass rusher or an elite playmaker in the middle. And we saw last week how even though the Lions' offensive line might have started a little low and slow in the run game, 3 of their 5 offensive starters did not give up a single pressure versus Kansas City. And down the stretch, they were able to wear out the defensive line. And in the fourth quarter, they were having their way with the Kansas City defense. They were running pretty much every play that they wanted to on the ground, and they were consistently getting chunk play after chunk play. And I think that's going to be a very similar scenario as to what happens this week at Ford Field. Now, taking a look at the matchup. So for the Detroit Lions offense, like I just mentioned, their offensive line significantly outshines the Seattle defensive line. I don't think there's any question about where that matchup is going to go, but I do think there is some conversation to be had about our running backs / tight ends versus their linebackers and our wide receivers versus their defensive backs. Now, last week, the Rams were able to find success with Puka Nacua having 10 catches for 119 yards, while Tutu Atwell had 6 receptions for 119 yards. Amon-Ra St. Brown is better than those two. Josh Reynolds is better than those two. Marvin Jones, I think, is a better wide receiver than those two. Khalif Raymond is a better receiver than those two. So, on paper, based off what happened last week, the Lions should be able to get chunk plays through the air. Their wide receivers should be able to create separation versus the defensive backs. But on paper, right, the Seattle Seahawks should have a very strong secondary. Jamal Adams, I believe, missed last game or was out. I don't know if he's going to play this week, but he is on the injury report. Devon Witherspoon, the 5th overall pick, is on the injury report. The only real good young player that they have in the secondary is, of course, Tyreek Woolen, who was the 3rd place player for Defensive Rookie of the Year last year. And last year, or this past week, I believe only allowed 1 reception for a few yards on 5 targets. Now, they have Quandre Diggs, who is a turnover machine, a former Detroit Lion. We know how good he is. But outside of those two, I do think the Detroit Lions should be able to pick apart the secondary. I do think Jahmyr Gibbs matches up very well with any linebacker in space. I do think David Montgomery matches up really well as a power back versus the Seattle front. And I do think we'll be able to take advantage with the weapons we do have over the depleted and injury-riddled Seattle Seahawks, who are, again, already facing some of those injury concerns. Now, I do think that this matchup is much more even than the Kansas City matchup, right? Last week, we talked about how Patrick Mahomes was your X factor, how Andy Reid was the best coach in the NFL, and how they had that home field advantage. The Kansas City Chiefs staff is better, the Kansas City quarterback play is better, and the Kansas City head coaching was better. That was the big reason why I thought that they weren't going to be able to pull out the win in Arrowhead. Of course, the Arrowhead Stadium being one of the biggest contributing factors to that. Home field advantage is a very real thing, and the Chiefs have one of the best home field advantages in the sport. This week, though, it's a little bit different. I think quarterback play is very, very similar. Jared Goff and Geno Smith are both top 5 quarterbacks in the conference. They're both playing with a lot of confidence. They're both going to put up really good numbers throughout the season. And I think that the quarterback play is very even. Geno Smith is a little bit better of a scrambler. He's a little bit more of a creative player. But Jared Goff, I think, is a little bit better with the methodical, longer drives. He's more efficient. He's a little bit more accurate and a little bit easier to predict whether he's going to have a good game or a bad game, whereas Geno Smith kind of ranges from a little bit better than Jared Goff to a little bit worse than Jared Goff, depending on the week. Coaching is very, very similar. I have all the respect in the world for Pete Carroll. I think him and his staff are very solid, but I think the Lions coaching staff matches up very well. Dan Campbell is really good. Ben Johnson is really good. Obviously, Aaron Glenn is really, really solid. And a lot of our positional coaches have the Lions playing very, very strongly. So I think that the coaching staffs are much more even this week, not having arguably a top 5 coach of all time in Andy Reid across from you on the other sideline. Now, this week, the Detroit Lions also have home field advantage. They're going to be at Ford Field. They're going to be at their home opener for the season in a revenge game. And believe me, the fans remember last year. The Lions coaching staff remembers last year. Everybody at Ford Field remembers the game last year. They remember putting up 45 points and losing, and they have all these defensive additions. They have the home field advantage. They have the crowd. And I think based off of last week, the Detroit Lions are the better football team. They're playing better football right now. And by no means is this going to be an easy victory for the Detroit Lions, but it should be a victory nonetheless. The Lions played a tougher team last week in a more hostile environment versus a significantly better coaching staff. And yeah, it took a little bit of luck, but they walked out with the victory, whereas Seattle was at home for the season opener. They had the talent advantage. They had, I would say, arguably the coaching advantage over just Sean McVay. Seattle's coaching staff is very strong and very deep, and they ended up losing by 17 points. So finally, for this game, I think the Detroit Lions will win. I think it'll be a close game, as I still believe Seattle is incredibly talented. I still believe that they are going to put up some points against this defense that doesn't quite have all the chemistry it needs yet. A lot of miscommunications last week, a lot of defenders talking to each other after the play, a lot of defenders kind of figuring out what roles they're playing and how to play with each other. I do think Seattle is going to be able to put up some points, but with the home field advantage, with the Lions being a significantly hotter team right now, and I think with the injury concerns for Seattle, the Lions are going to be able to take this one, starting off the season 2-0, going into the Atlanta game. So with that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Those are my predictions for the Detroit Lions versus Seattle Seahawks game. I think it might be a low-scoring game to start. I think the Lions offensive line will eventually wear down Seattle. I think they'll be able to get some chunk plays. I think they'll be able to put up some points. And I do think, especially with injury concerns at this point in the season, the Lions should be able to win this game fairly comfortably, even if the score at the end is very close. I expect the Lions to be in full control this entire game. Seahawks, by no means a bad football team, but they are on a cold streak. They just lost to a less talented football team at home. And of course, they do have a lot more injury concerns than the Detroit Lions do. I think health, I think coaching, and I think just momentum will carry the Detroit Lions to a victory in this game, and will leave them at 2-0 on the season. So with all that being said, that is all I got for you guys today. If you enjoyed the content, please make sure you down below, subscribe to the channel, help us get to 3,000 subscribers sooner rather than later. It helps the channel out a ton, and of course helps me out a lot. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below what you think is going to happen in week 2 versus the Seattle Seahawks. Type it down in the comments. I'd love to hear your predictions. Love to hear how you guys feel about this team so far. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.